This is 2.4, Issues of the Antebellum Period. We're going to start with Theme 1, Reviewing Sectionalism and the African American Culture. And this really is going to be mostly a review. Sectional review point number 1, social and cultural differences emerged during the antebellum. We mentioned before, antebellum means before the war, in this case before the Civil War. And the sectional differences between the North, the South, and the West are based largely on economic specialties. Again, this is, I believe, the third time we've discussed this. Industrialism and diversity in the North. This both feeds into and causes more immigration in the North, and then more immigration means there's more diversity. More immigrants need jobs, that leads more industrialism. So they play off of each other. And in the South, it's based on slave plantations, cash crops, and a strict hierarchy where you have the very wealthy planter elites, and then you have the poor yeoman class farmers in the middle, and then you have slaves at the bottom. At this point in history, we can talk about a regional pride being transformed into self-interested sectionalism. This really isn't a surprise because even during the Revolutionary period, Thomas Jefferson referred to Virginia as his country. So we can see that there's this northern ideology, southern ideology, western mentality, and the settlement of the West just made things worse. This is based largely on economics. Tariffs and internal improvements were pet projects in the North. Continuing on, the extension of slavery into the West was a southern goal. And this butts up against the northern desire to take free soil territory with them out west. Regionalism is based on historical roots. This regionalism, which turns into self-interested sectionalism, is going to be affected by Puritans and the Quaker beginnings in the North. Remember, the Puritans had towns that grew around the churches. This in turn led to town meetings, very democratic, and education was promoted in the North in order to promote reading of the Bible, or better reading of the Bible. Also, the Quakers in sort of the mid-Atlantic, which now we're tying into the North, they were very religiously tolerant, whereas the Puritans were not at that point. And these are going to be the first abolitionists. So this northern ideology, this northern regionalism is based in these two religious groups. What's probably just as, if not more important, is northern economics, right? Those diverse cities, the commercial centers, immigrants being used as cheap labor, education being used to assimilate the immigrants. Now that the immigrants were there, they had to learn how to be American, so education helped out with that. Population growth. So the North is growing at a much higher rate than the South because of the immigrants being attracted to those industrial jobs. This is a picture of Boston. Notice it's a shipping center. Just to wrap up the North, because again, this is review, they had few slaves. Eventually, the slaves are going to be emancipated, which means that African Americans had little impact on the culture. And even those free African Americans that were in the North are going to be considered second-class citizens. They are intentionally just disenfranchised during that age of Jackson, or the age of the common man of universal white male suffrage. In the North, they had a few political stances. We've already talked about these. They wanted tariffs in order to protect industry, and they wanted a strong national bank, which could then loan money to those industrialists. Southern regionalism, again, is based on the plantation system. We're going to see this this chart again in the future, but the Southern regionalism is dominated by the plantation culture. The privileged planter elites dominated society, the economy, culture, and politics. However, in the mentality of the era, people were aspiring to be in the planter elites, but most of the people in the South did not own slaves. They were poor, they lived on family farms. If you notice here in the bottom of the chart, out of all white families, only 38% owned slaves, and out of all white families, only 6% had what we'd consider large plantations of 20 or more slaves. They tended to be in the Deep South, and they tended to be, by the antebellum period, mainly involved in cotton production. What you will notice is that the higher level officials that we get, the more tied into the slave system they are. County government officials, about 18% are going to have 20 or more slaves. State legislatures, 33%. The delegates that finally go to decide whether or not to secede from the Union in 1860, 83% owned at least one slave. 41% were those large plantation owners. So we'll talk about that more later. Please recall that in Southern economics, deep navigable rivers meant ships could come right up to the plantations, which meant there's no need for commercial cities or large towns to develop. They didn't need to have that hub of activity. The economic activity came right to them. There was no public education because there was really no towns. So the Southerners, in the wealthy Southerners just hired tutors. The poor were too busy in the fields to worry about educating their kids, and slave literacy was outlawed. That we've found that doesn't really mean that no slaves learned how to read and write, but it was particularly banned. Few cities also meant that there was little industry. No industry meant there was few immigrants. With few immigrants, that meant that there was little diversity. There's African Americans, and then there's white Americans. So that is the diversity of the South at that point. What that means is that the African Americans had a large influence on the culture in the South. In fact, we're familiar with the South Carolina rice plantations. The rice plantations were typically set up on a system where when the slaves got the work done, they could get out of the fields. There wasn't typically a large overseer population keeping them working. As long as the work was done, then they could have time afterwards to do it. I guess we'd call it free time, leisure time. Not a lot of it, but enough that we do have this really interesting culture down here starting to develop. You guys may be familiar with this as the Gullah and the Geechee, usually a little bit more down north near Charleston, but it was also here in the plantation settlements, the rice plantations. In the West, remember the Western sectionalism. Settlers moved into the West. They took their cultural identities with them. The Northwest reflected New England values of free soil. Southern states, Kentucky, Alabama, Mississippi, Texas, those southern states were influenced by the Southern culture, which means the planter elites and the slavery system. Wow, I apologize for those two typos. The desire for the Southerners to extend slavery in the South, West, and the desire for the free soil to extend into the Northwest is going to cause a lot of problems. Remember, this is also the time of manifest destiny. Manifest destiny is this belief in a God-given right to move west. That's going to impact those Western settlers. They believe that they have a God-given right to be there. This also promotes a strong individualism. They are pioneers. They're going off on their own. They're going to settle this land. It also means that the Westerners wanted cheap land. In fact, they thought it was a birthright to be able to buy land cheaply and to have big family homesteads. Internal and transportation improvements were important to Westerners. One, they wanted roads and canals and all that to get out west, and then they wanted those same transportation systems to be able to get their farm products to the world market, or to get the raw materials that they gather back to those eastern factories to be made into finished products. So internal and transportation improvements are very important, and we saw in the last theme that is going to be a cause for a lot of issues between the Northerners and the Southerners. The North and the West sort of united together into a political agreement and alliance. The Westerners also wanted unregulated banking, and unregulated banking that they figured would lead to more inflation. More inflation means that you're paying money off that is worth less than what you borrowed, so it feels like you're able to make more money. It means that it's easier to pay off those mortgages for the farms. So essentially we have these three sections, the North, the South, and the West, and we just reviewed the sectional desires of each particular one.